Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in Saudi Arabia for negotiations with US officials that are aimed at ending the conflict with Russia. Canada's incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney vows that his country will never be part of the United States and that Canada will win the trade war. And Syria's President Ahmed al-Shara vows to track down those behind the deadly violence in western coastal areas of the country, violence that's estimated to have killed around 1,000 civilians. Hello and welcome to the program. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is gearing up for tomorrow's highly anticipated negotiations in Saudi Arabia. Well, those talks will be between Ukrainian and US officials, and they're aimed at ending the three-year conflict with Russia. Well, that meeting in Jeddah will be the first between the US and Ukrainian officials since President Zelenskyy's disastrous White House visit last month. Well, today, President Zelenskyy has been holding talks there in Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Well, Saudi Arabia has played various mediating roles since Russia's 2022 invasion, including brokering prisoner exchanges and hosting talks between delegations from Moscow and Washington. Well, US officials are planning to use tomorrow's meeting to determine whether or not Ukraine is willing to make material concessions to Russia to end the war. Well, according to Reuters news agency, the US delegation will also be watching for signs that the Ukrainians are serious about improving ties after that heated argument between Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy last month. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Matt Terrill, former Chief of Staff for Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. Matt joins us from Washington. Once again, thank you very much indeed for being with us here on Al Arabiya News. Secretary of State Rubio is heading to Saudi Arabia more or less as we speak. President Trump saying he expects some good results to come out of tomorrow's talks with the Ukrainian side. I mean, overall, do you think it's fair to say the mood ahead of these talks is fairly optimistic?
Absolutely. Look, I think the Trump administration is optimistic going into this meeting. I think they were probably optimistic going into the last one. Obviously, it was not the meeting that they thought they're going to have with respect to that meeting with President Zelenskyy and President Trump in the Oval Office last time. But this is a different time, different place now. And right now, I think it's all about getting this commercial economic deal signed. That's the first step here. I think getting that deal signed, which will be a good deal for the United States because it means that the United States will get paid back for the taxpayer funds that were paid towards this war. It's a good deal for Ukraine. It's going to help Ukraine rebuild its economy. And then finally, I think that this deal, certainly in the eyes of the administration, serves as a security guarantee in its own right. And thus, that will help to get to the next steps of this, which, of course, are hoping to get to a ceasefire. And then ultimately getting both President Zelenskyy, President Putin, their teams themselves at the negotiating table, negotiate away what's necessary, or I should say, negotiate towards what is necessary to get this war ended.
Yeah, you mentioned that meeting in the Oval Office last month. I think the word disastrous is probably the best adjective to describe it. Would you say that's all now water under the bridge, however?
Well, I think that was then and this is now. And I think, when it comes to diplomacy, it's never easy. Diplomacy is often difficult, but you don't know what you get out of diplomacy until you get to the negotiating table. So I think at the end of the day here, we're seeing one step here in a multi-pronged process. And that step, I suspect right now for the Trump administration, is getting this economic commercial deal signed. And I think they feel very good about that happening. I think this deal will be signed soon, both by President Trump and by President Zelenskyy. And then from there, it really is going into the next steps here. And that is going to be continuing shuttle diplomacy. You've seen the Trump administration deploy shuttle diplomacy throughout this process here. We'll see what takes shape with that, but the first step is getting this deal signed. I do think you're going to have a deal signed here very soon.
Yeah, just what you said in your first answer. I mean, you sort of suggested this minerals deal does contain what we can sort of interpret as being a security guarantee or security guarantees. Just tell us why you think there is some element of security guarantee in the minerals deal.
Sure. Well, look, I think the way that President Trump and his team view this is that deal, that minerals or economic commercial deal, if you will, that will be putting likely here U.S. citizens on the ground in Ukraine. You're going to have business people from the United States on the ground in Ukraine, other people, likely security forces, U.S. citizen security forces, I would suspect, on the ground in Ukraine. So the reality is, if you have citizens, U.S. citizens on the ground there, plus you just have a further stake from the United States on the ground in Ukraine, further investment by the United States into Ukraine, that's going to serve, I think, in the eyes of the Trump administration as a deterrence to President Putin. It's going to make it less likely for President Putin to invade. And I think it gets it more likely that you get to a ceasefire, and even more likely that you get both parties to the negotiating table here. So I think people need to recognize that this deal, this minerals deal, if you will, is not just about the minerals. It's not just about the economics of this or paying back, if you will, the taxpayers of the United States. I think this administration truly believes that that in its own right will serve as a security guarantee. It's not the only thing here. Obviously, we have to see what other actors here, such as European countries, do in terms of security guarantees. But from the United States standpoint, President Trump has been clear. He does not want U.S. boots on the ground in terms of troops. He wants to see a security guarantee, I think, through the lens of this minerals deal. It's one component of many components that will be required, I think. We'll see what happens here.
Now, last week, following on from that meeting at the Oval Office that we were just talking about, Washington suspended military aid to Ukraine, as well as intelligence sharing. It sounds like, well, from what President Trump said, they have just about, to quote him, ended the suspension of that intel sharing with Ukraine. I mean, does that as well help set the tone for a more cordial dialogue between the two sides?
Well, look, I think it helps in terms of the process here. I think obviously what is wanted here, particularly, of course, from Ukraine, is ensuring, that they're able to defend themselves and that there's not continued, attacks from Russia. So I think that this is a component that's going to be discussed here, no question, at the meeting. And I suspect it's something that's going to be on the table, of course. But look, I think at the end of the day, the realities are this. This is a war in the eyes of the Trump administration as a war of attrition. It's a stalemate. And, the reality is, in the eyes of the administration, Ukraine's not winning this war. And at the end of the day, the true place you got to get to is the negotiating table. I think what you're talking about right now certainly matters, I think, to Ukraine. It matters in terms of discussions here. We'll see what the administration does. Obviously, they did some pauses here to try and see what, to pause and kind of get the next steps here, particularly as it relates to the economic agreement. But the truth is, it all comes down to negotiation. I think the administration feels very strong about the fact that this war only comes to an end if you get both parties to the negotiating table. That's where I think the bigger elements of these discussions are going to be taking place here in Saudi Arabia. I think it's gearing both parties to get to the negotiating table here.
Yeah, I mean, taking away the intel was obviously applauded by Moscow. Now giving it back again, not likely to be viewed very kindly by Russia. And President Trump saying he's also considering more sanctions on Russia for, quote, pounding Ukraine during the course of the last few days. I mean, sounding a bit friendlier to Ukraine, a bit less friendly to Russia this last couple of days. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it's fair to say that President Trump, the country that President Trump is aligned with is the United States. He made that very clear in his past statements that what he wants right now is for the killing to stop. In his words, you've seen obviously killing both on the Ukraine side and on the Russian side. The reality is President Trump wants to end this war. He wants to do it in a negotiated way. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's not just with this conflict. You look at what he's trying to do in the Middle East. You look at recently what he said yesterday on Fox News. It relates to Iran. Want to try and negotiate with Iran to stop them from nuclear capabilities. So, look, I think that this is just the mission of this administration. It is to deploy a foreign policy strategy that is centered on negotiation. I go back to that word, negotiation and diplomacy. That's where the president's at right now. So look, I think as you go into these meetings and you go further along in the process here, President Trump wants this war to end, and I think he wants it to end now. But the reality is you got negotiation coming up, you got diplomacy. That's not going to likely be easy, of course. I think you're going to have to, there's going to be a multi-pronged process here. But the good news is it looks like there's progress being made. And I think the first step here, not to be repetitive here, but the first step truly is getting this economic commercial deal signed. After that, I think you're going to see the next steps here in terms of diplomacy really take shape.
In just a moment, we're going to be speaking to the former British Defence Secretary. And with that in mind, I just want to ask you about the fact that British diplomats were meeting with Ukrainian negotiators during the course of the weekend in Kyiv to try to get them ready for the talks in Saudi Arabia. I just wondered how Washington views the role played by the United Kingdom and Ukraine's other European allies. I mean, does the Trump administration applaud them? Does the Trump administration take them seriously, do you think?
Well, look, absolutely. I think he takes them seriously. I think, President Trump had a good meeting with the leader of UK, and I think the administration has good relationships with UK leadership. I think at the end of the day, though, it's about who will be playing what role in this process here. I think the United States views themselves as playing the lead role here in trying to get to a negotiated end of this war. And then, look, there are going to be discussions around security guarantees. And obviously, you've seen President Trump lean into discussions about defense spending. You've seen, these European leaders discuss defense spending as it relates to NATO. So there's other things taking shape here, particularly as it relates to discussions around NATO and defense spending. But as it relates to this conflict, Ukraine-Russia war, the reality is President Trump has been clear that the security guarantee we're going to provide as the United States is going to be, I suspect, that this minerals deal, this economic commercial deal, is going to be through helping to provide negotiation here. And then ultimately, I think he's going to be calling upon European leaders to be the ones, if there's going to be, boots or troops or any of those military kind of elements here going forward, that Europe will have to play that role. Now, again, we'll see what happens here, but that appears to be where the Trump administration is leaning. And I think at the end of the day here, he wants to ensure that this conflict comes to a negotiated end, that this happens in a peaceful manner. His goal here is to get to peace. That's it. And from there, also doing the things that are required under this minerals agreement in terms of the economic elements of it. This is going to be a joint partnership between Ukraine and the United States. Again, I go back to, not to be redundant here, but that deal in itself is the first step here. I think get from that deal, then you get to likely a role of ceasefire, then you get to negotiation. And obviously, since it's the United States will be playing a role in all this, of course, European leaders will as well. Of course, President Trump, as he has been, will be having meetings with those leaders and deploying diplomacy in that sense as well.
Yeah, but I mean, having American people on the ground in Ukraine tapping for valuable minerals is not quite the same as having boots on the ground, is it? I mean, do you think there is a case for having equipped American soldiers on the ground to ensure the peace actually lasts?
Well, I think where the Trump administration is coming from, and frankly, President Trump himself, is that the United States has deployed billions of dollars to this conflict in terms of this war. And I think where he's at is that, if there's going to be the element, the variable of troops on the ground, in his view, I think he views it as Europe playing that role. I think he does truly believe, as his foreign policy team believes, that under this deal, U.S. citizens being on the ground there will matter. And I truly believe that they think that will be a deterrence to President Putin. Now, again, I go back to it's multi-pronged. It may very well be that you have those military forces that are required. But I think at the end of the day, President Trump has been very clear that that's going to be Europe's role, not the United States' role. I think where he is at right now is that the United States will play a role in this in terms of going forward, in terms of security guarantees. But I point back to that deal. That I think is really where President Trump is leaning into that deal as being a multi-pronged deal, part of it serving as a security guarantee in its own right. But then again, this is going to be multi-layered to this. This is not a one kind of element of this. There's going to be multiple elements in terms of not just getting to a ceasefire, but ultimately having lasting peace. I think ultimately the goal of the administration, though, is not for this to be a short-term end of this war, but to ensure this war never happens again. This is not going to be a solution or a true end if it's just in the micro. You got to have a macro fix, and that means ending this war now, but also ensuring it never happens again. I do think that the administration feels that this minerals deal, this economic deal, will certainly help with long-term security guarantees. We'll see what happens here.
Okay. I mean, of course, Washington has provided last year 40% of the military aid to Ukraine, but the rest of it did come from Europe. So Europe, obviously, an important voice in all of this. I'm going to be asking the British Secretary of Defence, the former British Secretary of Defence, if he thinks perhaps the Europeans should be trying to get a minerals deal of their own to recoup that other 60%. But just to wrap up our conversation, Matt, I mean, overall, heading into these talks in Saudi Arabia tomorrow, you're hopeful that we're now at the beginning of the end of this war?
I am hopeful. I think the majority of Americans are hopeful. Look, I mean, President Trump outlined his plans on Ukraine, Russia, and touched on his plans in his last speech last week to Congress. Over 70% of Americans, based on a CBS poll, agreed with President Trump's plan or had a favorable view of President Trump's plan on Ukraine and Russia that he outlined in his speech last week to Congress. So I think, look, what we're seeing right now are things that President Trump has been consistently talking about in terms of his vision, his plan for ending this war. But at the end of the day, it's about negotiations, about diplomacy. And as I've said before here, obviously that is not an easy path. I don't think it's going to be done in one day, obviously. I think this is going to be a process, but I'm absolutely optimistic. I think this deal will get signed. And I think from there, you're going to see shuttle diplomacy continue to take shape. I think you will see both parties get to the negotiating table and that this war will be ended. Obviously, it's something that President Trump campaigned on. He campaigned on ending this war. Right now, he's trying to deliver on that. We'll see what happens here.
All right. We certainly shall. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Matt Terrill, thanks again.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, the United Kingdom is offering Kyiv advice on how to handle those talks with the United States and Saudi Arabia. Well, the UK Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, is reported to have spent the weekend in Ukraine briefing President Zelenskyy ahead of the talks with the United States. Well, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is going to host a second meeting this week for leaders of around 20 countries that are believed to have expressed interest in possibly joining a coalition to help Ukraine. Well, that meeting, led by Prime Minister Starmer, will be a virtual one held online. Well, in another development, Moscow has hit out at the UK, accusing London of being, quote, the main instigator of global conflict. Well, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service added that the UK views the restoration of ties between Moscow and Washington as being, quote, a threat. Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to Sir Michael Fallon, the former UK Secretary of State for Defence. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Sir Michael. We're just hearing today Moscow pointing the finger at London, calling the United Kingdom the main instigator of global conflict. I just wondered, first of all, why you think the Russians are saying this and why now?
Well, good afternoon. That seems to me to be completely over the top. It's no secret that Britain, along with other European countries, has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine ever since Russia invaded it. But it's certainly a very odd move now. Britain wants to see these peace negotiations succeed. We've supported them in principle. Our Prime Minister has been over to Washington to emphasize that to the President. So we have no interest in prolonging this war. We want to find a just settlement as soon as possible.
But Russia's argument is that London sees the United States and Russia in a sort of a rapprochement phase. And Russia argues that this is a threat to British interests. I mean, is there any argument in this?
No, it's a rather warped logic. It would only be valid if Britain was trying to stop any kind of peace agreement. We're not. Of course, anybody can quibble with President Trump's tactics, but what he's focused on, of course, is bringing the two sides in all this together. And that is what is now happening out in the Middle East. And that matters to us in Britain. In the end, this war has to be brought to a conclusion.
I mean, before I read those comments coming out of Moscow today, I was thinking to myself that President Trump's rapprochement with President Putin could arguably weaken President Putin, because this rallying cry against the West has been a fairly consistent pillar of Moscow's domestic messaging. And with that gone, I mean, couldn't there be a drop in public support for President Putin?
Well, there could well be, and it may be that Moscow hasn't quite woken up, to the disruptive force of what President Trump is doing. But we may be getting ahead of ourselves here. The negotiations haven't started yet. What the president is trying to do and is doing is getting both sides to the table. And that is the only way that you can make a start on this. And I guess there's a long road ahead. It took 2 years to get a peace settlement agreed in Korea. It took 3 years to get a settlement in Vietnam. So between now and any possible ceasefire and then any final agreement on territory or sanctions and the release of Russian assets, there's a long, long way to go.
How strong does Russia look to you right now?
Well, clearly, it's been strong enough to continue the fight in Ukraine and probably could continue it it's transformed its economy onto a wartime footing. So they are they are able to replenish some of the material that's being used up in Ukraine, and they do seem to have an endless supply of reinforcements. So to that extent, they maintain that kind of superiority of force over Ukraine. Yet, of course, there is damage, and the longer the war goes on, the structural side of the economy, there's high inflation. There are high interest rates, and there is always the risk for those in power that sooner or later there may be serious unrest as to the direction of the country. Not least, of course, because their assets have been frozen abroad. There are sanctions on a lot of the stuff they would otherwise be importing or able to export. And life is not as pleasant there in Russia as it was before the war started.
Ukraine, of course, has had numerous setbacks lately, not least on the battlefield, but one in particular from the United States, well, two in particular from the United States, the suspension of military aid and the suspension of intelligence sharing with Ukraine. But we have heard from President Trump, who said on Air Force One that the United States had just about ended that suspension. I mean, as well as making for more cordial talks in Jeddah, could that make, do you think, is that going to make a significant difference once again to Ukraine's abilities on the battlefield?
Well, I hope, ending the suspension, I hope it will enable Ukraine to better defend itself, particularly against these appalling missile strikes. But I always thought the suspension, was a temporary one. As I said, President Trump is driving both sides to the negotiating table. And you might not like some of his individual tactics in doing that. You might feel some of them are a bit one-sided. But the key thing is that those negotiations have now a prospect of getting started in earnest. And that, in the end, is the only way that this war is going to be brought to a conclusion.
So it sounds like you agree with what President Trump's doing and saying, even if you don't agree entirely on the methodology.
No, I don't agree with some of the tactics and the methodology, and I don't agree with some of the language and the way a head of state like Zelenskyy was treated in the White House. But Trump is right on two crucial points. One is that Ukraine is not going to win this war, even with American help. It's had American help for 3 years now, and it's still not winning the war. And secondly, the Europeans do not have a plan for ending the war. And I think Trump has lighted on those two key points, that in the end, there's got to be a negotiated settlement of some kind. And the sooner we get started on that, and if that means bullying people along, then so be it. Now, certainly you can quibble with the tactics and you can resent some of the strong-arm nature of them. But there's no doubt that those negotiations will now get underway. And I'm more optimistic, certainly, than I was a month ago or before President Trump was inaugurated.
Now, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is not from your political party. Just for the benefit of our audience, he's a Labour Prime Minister. He's holding a second meeting of Ukraine allies on Saturday. I just want to get your overall view, how you rate the British government's response to this extremely complicated diplomatic situation and the issues surrounding Ukraine, as well as Russia, and in particular with this second Trump administration installed in Washington. How do you think he's been doing?
Well, first, let me emphasise that the British government has all-party support. The Conservative opposition, the others, are fully supporting the Prime Minister in what he's doing. Secondly, of course, the fact his politics are very different to ours, or indeed to President Trump's, is irrelevant. Britain has a role to play here. We've been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. We're one of the leading militaries in NATO outside the United States. So Britain has to be involved. Now, you may remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was talk that this was really going to be nothing to do with the Europeans, or indeed nothing to do with the Ukrainians. This would all be sorted out between the United States and Russia on their own. Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron have ensured actually that is not what's going to happen. The Ukrainians are going to be involved in the negotiations, and the Europeans will have to be involved as well, not least because any settlement that is reached is going to have to be policed to make sure that it's secure. The two previous agreements holding back Russia, of course, were broken by Russia. So there is every European incentive in making sure that this time we have an agreement that really sticks.
Yeah, because of course a rushed deal would obviously be unlikely to last. It wouldn't be a lasting deal. But does all of this not just show once again, I mean, this is something we've talked about in the past, but I mean, there has been a long period of heavy reliance by the United Kingdom and Europe on the United States. And I just wonder what you think needs to be done to rectify this. We've heard the British Prime Minister saying they're going to increase the percentage of GDP that is allocated for defence. It doesn't sound like a huge increase. Is he doing enough?
Well, first of all, this isn't just President Trump. Every American president has been saying this for years. President Obama said it in my time when he came to the NATO summit back in 2014, when we agreed to spend 2%. So, you know, the Europeans now, I think, have had sufficient shock from President Trump's arrival and his decision to try and get this war ended to realize that the bulk of the burden of security in Europe now has to be borne by Europeans. So we will see, I hope, not just Britain, but other European countries step up. A third of the alliance, by the way, still doesn't spend the 2% that was agreed 10 years ago. So the Americans are right to be aggrieved by that. So that's really the first priority, is all of us in Europe have got to switch spending from some of the welfare spending that we've got accustomed to over to defence. And secondly, there are a lot of capabilities where we are hopelessly dependent on the United States, whether it's air missile defence, air-to-air refueling, heavy lift, surveillance aircraft. These things we will have to do more for amongst ourselves in Europe, and that means closer cooperation amongst the European defence companies so that we have that capability and we're not always dependent on the Americans, because the Americans feel very strongly now that their number one threat isn't Russia, it's China. And they have to reinforce their own military over in Indo-Pacific. And therefore we have to pick up the strain in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic that sort of post-Brexit, you know, it looks as though the UK could be set to have a more significant role in Europe's collective defence than it did before Brexit. I mean, do you think that's a fair statement?
Well, that's wholly possible, but it doesn't undermine the alliance, the relationship that we have with the United States. I think legally, you know, having had Brexit, we're not being forced to choose. And you see Prime Minister Starmer and the British government at the moment, I think, playing that extremely skillfully, using their influence in Washington and putting themselves as something of a bridge between the United States and the rest of Europe. Now, the rest of Europe, famously, I think it was State Secretary Kissinger used to say, when I want to contact Europe, who do I call? You know, the European Union is there, but some of its members are neutral. They're not part of NATO. So Britain, as one of the biggest militaries in Europe, alongside France, Brexit or no Brexit, still will have a very big responsibility and a very big role to play.
And with regards to this idea of having British peacekeeping forces deployed to Ukraine, what do you make of the idea of British boots on the ground there?
Well, I think the Russians will be very uncomfortable with that. And I'd be surprised if they agree to British or French troops, NATO troops, if you like, so close to the front line, wherever that's finally agreed, eyeballing Russian troops. And I think that'd be a pretty uncomfortable position for British troops to be placed in. So it may be that a different kind of security guarantee is required, perhaps a reassurance force, not necessarily on the border itself, more surveillance from the air, and you know, a reserve force ready to deploy if there are serious breaches of any agreement that's reached.
So, Michael, we spoke to your former colleague, Sir Gerald Howarth, last week, who expressed dismay at the state of the transatlantic alliance. And he also described the minerals deal that President Trump was aiming to strike with Ukraine as being, quote, grubby. I wonder what you make of that. Do you agree with Sir Gerald?
Well, first, I think the alliance is in as good a place as it could be. We have a new ambassador in Washington. The president has spoken frequently with the prime minister. Our prime minister has been over there very successfully. So I don't think the relationship Britain has with the United States has been damaged. On the contrary, I think there's some evidence now that the United States is listening to Britain and to France in the way that it proceeds towards an agreement. So far as minerals is concerned, I think, a lot of the Western countries are now focused on the grip that China has on some of the minerals that are essential to our new technologies, to our medicine, to our energy, and to our military. A lot of those minerals are in Ukraine. So I don't think it's any surprise that the Americans have brought that into play. But that's an agreement that they will be pressing on Ukraine, which presumably will be part of a much wider agreement so far as peace is concerned.
Should the UK try and get a minerals deal, do you think, with Ukraine to try and recoup some of the money it's spent on this war?
Well, we're overdue a critical minerals strategy. We too have to be sure now that we can source these various minerals. We've had some very negative moves from China restricting the supply of minerals from China. So we too do need to look and see how we can access minerals. There are minerals in east and western Ukraine, and who knows what a future agreement may transpire. But we need access to minerals as well. And I think everybody involved is going to have to think very seriously now about how we help rebuild Ukraine, whether that's help with infrastructure, help in modernizing its industry, giving it access to European markets, and so on. And minerals could well be part of that.
Now, you were a defense secretary for a short period during President Trump's first term. I just wonder how you found dealing with him and his administration, and how do you think he is equipped now?
Well, in his first term, he came to office perhaps unexpectedly. He didn't have fully worked out policies. He had instincts. He'd never run anything. He'd never been in government or in public administration. And he didn't know many of the people. He appointed generals, very good generals, but he didn't know them, and he ended up falling out with a number of them. This time, certainly, President Trump has been much more organized. A lot of preparatory work has gone into it. And some of his advisors who came through London last summer were very, very clear about how they were going to move away from Europe and better defend the homeland against their principal threat, which is China. So to that extent, I think Trump too is better organized and better prepared. But you still, of course, see classic Trump ploys at work, the propensity to disrupt, to say quite outrageous things, sometimes to make outrageous moves and then pull back a little later on. You're seeing that to some extent with tariffs, and I hope you'll see that also with the suspension of aid to Ukraine.
So just lastly, to wrap up, I mean, it doesn't sound to me from anything you've said that you're particularly worried about the state of health of the so-called special relationship.
No, I think the special relationship has been through, it's been through its ups and downs. Margaret Thatcher used to have rows with Ronald Reagan, even though they were great soulmates. Prime Minister Starmer is not a soulmate of President Trump, but they've already proved that they can work together. And more importantly, I think Britain has established that we do have to be involved. The Europeans have a legitimate interest in making sure that we can get to an agreement in Ukraine that sticks and that prevents Russia ever again invading another part of our continent.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sir Michael Fallon, thanks again.
Thank you, Tom.
In other news, the incoming Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is vowing that Canada will come out on top in the trade dispute with the United States. Well, the former central bank boss has also said his country is willing to take the gloves off. Well, Carney was elected by the Liberal Party on Sunday to succeed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and that transition is going to happen during the course of the coming days. Well, the incoming premier campaigned on a promise to stand up to Donald Trump.
We didn't ask for this fight. We didn't ask for this fight. But Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win. Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed.
The incoming Prime Minister of Canada. Well, the tariffs feud is not the only factor causing tensions between the two longtime allies. President Trump has also threatened to turn Canada into the 51st state of the United States. Well, Mark Carney said that idea was a pipe dream that will, quote, never, ever happen.
The Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. Think about it. If they succeeded, they would destroy our way of life. In America, healthcare is a big business. In Canada, it is a right. America is not Canada. And Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Aurel Braun, who is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor Braun. A resounding victory for Canada's incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney in that leadership contest. But it might be the case he's not around in that job for very long. That's right, isn't it?
Indeed. Some would have suggested that this was not really a political contest, but it was more of a coronation within the Liberal Party. And that was the good news for Mr. Carney. But the bad news might be indeed that he will have to face an election, and elections are uncertain. If we would have had an election 2 months ago, the Liberal Party was barely alive. Now, thanks to the confrontation with Donald Trump, the Liberal Party has made enormous gains, and they at least have a chance at winning an election. We will see if Mr. Carney will call an election early, or he will wait until October when there has to be an election.
So you're saying that President Trump has sort of inadvertently handed the Liberal Party a great gift here?
It is really ironic because it's clear with Mr. Trump, it has been said that all politics are local, but with Mr. Trump, it seems to be all politics are personal. And he has such an intense dislike of Justin Trudeau. He kept teasing him by calling him governor. I do not think it was either serious or realistic that he wanted to make Canada the 51st state. He understands that that will not happen. But the Liberals used that very effectively. Mr. Trudeau certainly ran with it. And so Mr. Trump, in a sense, may have fatally damaged the Conservative Party, which would have had policies that would have been much more congruent with the international interests that were enunciated by Mr. Trump when he was running for office. So international politics are full of irony. And also, it is interesting that Mr. Trudeau wanted to create the first post-national state. And in Canada, standing up to Mr. Trump, Canada has become far more nationalistic. So when you listen to the speech by Mr. Carney, it is one of the most nationalistic speeches possible. We are not like the United States. We're going to differ from the United States. We will never be part of the United States. And this is raw nationalism.
Indeed. I mean, just looking ahead to the election in Canada, which has to happen before October, I mean, what are the polls suggesting might happen in that election? I know that we're still a long way off and it might happen in the weeks ahead, but he could presumably hold off on the election for another couple of months, couldn't he?
Indeed, they could hold off on that election. This is the advantage of a parliamentary system. that whoever is prime minister, whatever party is in charge, they get to choose when the election will take place within the time limit that they have. There is a hard stop, so to speak, but within that time, they can take advantage if there's an upswing in the polls. And the trend lines now seem to be favorable to the Liberals. But Mr. Carney will be tested because the kind of things that he said about the United States, those will come back and make it more difficult for him to negotiate. He, in Canada, wants to present himself as a nationalist. In the case of the United States, he wants to present himself as a responsible partner, someone who already said that he is in favor of rapidly increasing Canadian defense expenditures. This has been one of the key points that Mr. Trump was making, that Canada was underperforming. And indeed, Canada is one of the exceptions now in NATO. We are spending far less than 2%. And Mr. Trudeau, who seemed to have had an aversion to military spending, said that we would not reach that 2% minimum until 2032. Mr. Carney said that we could do it in a couple of years. So it remains to be seen if he's going to do that. But he's got the issue of tariffs. He's got the issue of how he's going to deal with China and how that will impact relations with the United States, because the Americans do not want goods to come through China, from China come through Canada or Mexico. So this is like three-dimensional chess. And it's going to be a very difficult ride for Mr. Carney, partly because Mr. Trump is so utterly unpredictable.
Yeah, but when it comes to the economy, Mr. Carney looks a lot like being the right person in the right place at the right time, especially in the face of those 25% levies on Canadian goods. But when it comes to other issues, aside from the economy, what can Mr. Carney bring to the table?
Well, on defense, he can do more, and this could be something that would be pleasing to the United States, that Canada would sharply increase our defense spending, that the slogan, the true north, strong and free, is more than a slogan, that it becomes an actual policy. He has been a banker, so he would understand private enterprise much more than Mr. Trudeau, and he does not carry the psychological baggage that Mr. Trump intensely disliked Justin Trudeau, and the feeling was mutual. But this election campaign also meant that there are statements, words out there by Mr. Carney that Mr. Trump could be very annoyed by, because he's extremely sensitive. And even in terms of the economy, I think this was one of the factors that especially people in the Liberal Party felt, that Mr. Trudeau had so mismanaged the economy that we would benefit from having someone who was a banker, who had expertise in private enterprise. But the Canadian economy is very dependent on trade with the United States. 80% of our trade is with the U.S. So if those trade relationships unravel, then it will be very difficult to have a strong, growing economy in Canada. So the international and the local are intricately linked.
Sure. And I mean, Washington, though, says the tariffs have a very good reason. They argue this is all about that drug, fentanyl, coming across the border, as well as illegal migrants. I mean, do people in Canada think that this is in any way justified?
No, and this is why I think there's been this surge of patriotism, because the excuses, if you like, given by Mr. Trump ring hollow. There's a very small amount of fentanyl going across the Canadian border. And in terms of the undocumented migrants or illegal immigrants, again, the numbers are nothing compared to what was happening on the southern borders. So we had hoped that we would have been treated differently from Mexico. But Mr. Trump, I think, has had such an intense dislike of Justin Trudeau that he wanted to damage him as much as possible. But in the process, he unwittingly helped revive the Liberal Party. And so we are now at a stage where there are high expectations of Mr. Carney. And this is one of the disadvantages. Yes, he comes in with a lot of momentum, but also tremendous expectations. And it will be very difficult to fulfill those expectations, especially in the light of the fact that there's so many unresolved issues where there are certain legitimate concerns, such as defense, such as protectionism. We protected our dairy industry with very high tariffs. Would that be resolved? Steel and aluminum, that's another factor. So it is, no matter who is the leader in Canada, even if, let's say, Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives managed to win, they're not going to have an easy time. But given the condition of the economy right now in Canada, given the fact that Canada cannot just switch its trade overnight to Europe and elsewhere, given that we are so dependent on this relationship, given that the American economy is 10 times the size of that of Canada, it is sort of like that line from Cervantes where they talk about the ceramic pitcher and the stone, where they say, well, it doesn't really matter. The ceramic pitcher is so vulnerable. It doesn't really matter whether the stone hits the pitcher or the pitcher hits the stone. It's bad for the pitcher. We are the ceramic pitcher. We are much more vulnerable than the United States.
Sure, but with 59-year-old Mark Carney, you've got someone who's been a central banker of not just one country, but two, because our viewers might not know this. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada and the governor of the Bank of England as well. Yes. He's no novice. He could probably outmaneuver, some are saying, President Trump in a trade war. But can he stave off a recession?
Well, the premise would be here that he can outmaneuver Mr. Trump. And it's not easy to outmaneuver someone as 10 times the economic power that you have. It's so unpredictable and so vindictive. And yes, all that experience with the Bank of England, and obviously he has that international experience. He has business experience that could appeal to Mr. Trump. But there are so many kind of points of contention that anyone, even in the best of circumstances, would have a lot of difficulty dealing with a president in the White House, such as Mr. Trump. And then, there are all sorts of other differences. What are we going to do in terms of our relationship with Ukraine? Canada has had a very strong relationship with Ukraine. We are really committed supporters of Ukraine. Look at the current policy in the White House. And political policy, strategic policy, and economic policy are all intertwined. So yes, that experience indeed may come in useful in certain ways that Mr. Carney is bringing, and I think this was one of the reasons why he won so overwhelmingly. But at the same time, there are so many other considerations. So we will have to see. I think at this point, perhaps we could be cautiously optimistic, but I think that's about the best we can do.
Just lastly, Professor, 1 decade of leadership by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is about to come to an end. How do you think history is going to look back on his 10 years in office?
It's going to be difficult because he wanted to create something new, a post-national state, and that did not really work out. He emphasized relations with Aboriginal people, which was a noble undertaking, but he neglected defense. He did not understand the connection between those two, that if he wanted to have a better hearing in Europe and elsewhere, he also had to deliver on defense. He supported Ukraine, but I don't think he really understood the threat that Russia presents in the Arctic. And we have been slow and late in responding to that. So I think it will be a case of good intentions and very poor delivery.
All right, Professor Aurel Braun, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us here on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, Syria's defense ministry announced on Monday the end of a major security operation in coastal provinces. This after days of violence and mass killings that sparked international concern. Well, the violence erupted between Syria's new security forces and loyalists of the former government of the toppled President Bashar al-Assad. Well, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that close to 1,500 people have been killed in the violence. Well, the new Syrian leader, Ahmed al-Shara, is vowing to hunt down the perpetrators, and he says he will hold anyone who overstepped the new ruler's authority to account. Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak to Mick Mulroy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East under President Trump, who joins us now from Montana. Mick, great to have you with us once again. Let's start by talking about those clashes that we saw leading up to the weekend and during the weekend, clashes between gunmen and security forces. What's your understanding as to what caused this flare-up in violence?
So, Tom, it looks like there was elements of the former Assad regime's security forces that attacked the interim government, if you will's forces, and caused this to start. It didn't end with that. It appears by most reports that it resulted in over 1,300 deaths, many of which, if not most of which, were civilians. So there's a lot of very graphic, disturbing videos that have been posted to social media, and it's really, of course, gotten not only the country and the region, but the world concerned about just what direction Syria is going. It's already started a refugee flow again, leaving Syria, going into Lebanon, for example, and it's something that it's going to be looked at very closely in the UN and potentially in these regional meetings that are discussing the matter.
Does this suggest to you that President Bashar al-Assad, the former leader of Syria, who was ousted at the end of last year, does it suggest he still has some influence, some sway over what happens in the country he once led?
It's possible. I mean, we don't know whether he was directing these attacks or this was just done from a small group on the coast, which is the sect that Assad comes from, whether they felt that they needed to do this for their own reasons. It's also unclear whether these were the forces of Ahmed al-Shara, the interim president, if you will, at his direction, or he didn't have a direction and essentially they went on their own. Both are very concerning to the other groups in Syria who are now likely going to just harden their positions and start arming themselves out of concern that this could erupt into yet another civil war inside Syria.
President Ahmed al-Shara has been accusing Iran of having played a hand in this violence in the northwest of Syria. I just wonder whether you're hearing any similar suggestions in the United States.
Yes. So Hezbollah has supported the Assad regime throughout its time when they were in power. So it's likely that they have direct connections to all of these former pro-Assad militias. And it could be, and there is reports that Hezbollah is actively working with them and potentially Iran directly. The IRGC Quds Force could be working with them to create this internal conflict that would essentially push back on the power that was gained by Ahmed al-Shara and his formerly HTS forces, which are supported by Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, most Arab states have rallied around the government in Damascus and expressed solidarity with them. I mean, do you think the new government in Damascus is well supported in the region, with the pretty obvious and notable exception of Iran?
So in the region, with the exception of Israel, I think there's a lot of support. At least there's initial support for Ahmed al-Shara. He has said all the right things. But it's important to point out his background is he was the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria. So from the United States perspective, there's a lot of hesitation to engage, at least in this current administration, the Trump administration, with his government until he proves that he is what he says he is, which is completely reformed and wanting to have a Syria that's inclusive of all groups. This, of course, challenges that, whether he either directed it, and I'm not saying he did, or he could not stop it. That also is troubling to, I think, the U.S. administration, who's going to be looking at just how he reacts to this. It's something I think is going to be a main topic in the Security Council and the United Nations this week.
Up until this point, had the transition in Syria looked largely smooth from where you sit?
Yes, I mean it was a very quick fall of the Assad regime, and certainly an unexpected one, followed by, I think, all the right statements coming out of this interim government when it comes to inclusiveness. There was some concern about statements they couldn't hold elections, for example, for 4 years. But this is something that I think is still in the to be determined category, at least for many in the West, especially the United States, of whether they will allow this to be a government chosen by the Syrian people, by all the Syrian people, or whether this will simply be a replacement for an authoritarian regime. I think from the U.S. point of view, that is still something they are watching very closely. And the horrible images that we saw in events, more importantly, that we saw in the last 4 to 5 days are really challenging whether this is something that's going to go in the direction of peace, stability, inclusiveness, or whether this is going to surge back into a civil war that further harms the Syrian people.
And the former President Bashar al-Assad is all the while, we understand, in Russia, in Moscow. What do you think will happen to him? What do you think should happen to him?
Well, I think he should be held responsible for the massive amounts of war crimes that he committed against his own people, hundreds of thousands of deaths and over 1 million that had to flee. He is the worst perpetrator of crimes against humanity of our generation. And that's what should happen to him, is he should be held accountable for that. Whether that will happen, it's unlikely. Russia essentially assisted him throughout his regime and is largely responsible for many of the crimes he would be accused of. So they're probably going to safe harbor him for the rest of time if they can.
You don't see him as becoming a bargaining chip, perhaps? Perhaps a pawn to be played, a card to be played by the Russians, who presumably want to maintain a presence on the Mediterranean coast where they have not just the naval base, but also an airstrip?
That's right, Tom, and a very good questions. It shows you the Russians could easily turn against you, and if they believe it's in their own interest, they have that bargaining chip sitting in probably a condominium in Moscow. And that is something that the al-Shara government has said they wanted to do, which is to prosecute, I should say, Assad for the crimes he committed against the Syrian people. So if Russia wants to keep those facilities, as you mentioned, in Tartus and Latakia on the coast, that is perhaps something that they would like to see and be willing to do, is turn over Assad to be prosecuted.
Do you see al-Shara, the president of Syria, reaching a deal with any of the regional powers that we were talking about just a moment ago? I mean, is it less or more likely that he'll strike a deal with Israel or Iran, for example, those being two powers with which there don't seem to be any relations that we're aware of at this stage, as things stand? Do you think that might change?
It's possible. Of course, if he gets the backing of the Arab countries in the region and he continues to carry out what he said he was going to do, again, a reformist, and address the serious atrocities that happened in the last 4 days, again, over 800 of those killed were civilians, including women. And I think that has to be addressed. But if that happens, and there is a path, a framework toward a government that's selected by the Syrian people, and that all the Syrian people and all the different sections in Syria feel included in the government, then I think there is a way forward that would be much more beneficial to the Syrian people. If that's not the case, then this has the potential to go south, in the sense that this could be another civil war, and it could just be devastating. And I think all the regional partners should do what they can to ensure that doesn't happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Mick Mulroy, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.